Welcome to the Wednesday, September 27th, 2023 meeting of the Redmond Planning Commission. I'll call this meeting to order. And I'll start with the roll call of the commission. Commissioner Woodyear.
Present.
Commissioner Aparna.
Present.
Commissioner Van Nyman.
Present.
Commissioner Sheffrin.
Present.
Commissioner Nueva Camina.
Present.
Vice Chair Weston.
Present.
And I'm Chair Sherry Nichols. Also joining us tonight and extending their workday are staff members Chris Wyatt, Jeff Churchill, Lauren Alpert, Ian Lefcourt, Kim Dietz, and Becky Fry. I look for a motion to approve the agenda tonight.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
And the agenda is approved. This is the point in the meeting which we allow for items from the audience, opportunity for public comment on any item that is not the subject of a public hearing. Ian, did anyone sign up?
Nope.
Okay. I will remind everyone that as we move into election season with the election approaching, that RCW 42.17A.555 prohibits any public comment or discussion during Planning Commission meeting in support of or opposition of ballot measures or candidates. Not a place for campaigning. Okay, so with that, we will move into the Redmond Zoning Code rewrite, the annual code cleanups, public hearing, and study session. Kim, do you want to start us off?
Yes, good evening, Commissioners. I'm Kimberly Dietz, Principal Planner with Current Planning, Long Range Planning, and Economic Development. I bridge over a couple divisions. Tonight, you are holding a public hearing on the Redmond Zoning Code rewrite minor amendments for this year. They are typically an annual amendment package that comes to you. So these are minor in nature. Staff has received a few comments, which you have also received in your mailbox. I do not have a presentation this evening. If anyone is interested in the topic, the Commission did have a presentation during your last meeting. And I would like to pass back to Madam Chair for the public hearing portion.
Okay, then I will open the public hearing. Ian, has anyone signed up for the public hearing?
We have 3 individuals, and first is David M.
I will remind you to state your name and address for the record.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. I'm David Morton. I live at 19934 Northeast Union Hill Road, Redmond, 98053. Redmond must take proactive steps to safeguard its drinking water aquifer from contamination resulting from new developments in its critical aquifer recharge areas, or CARAs. To achieve this, the city should consider amending its zoning code regarding its CARAs. The prohibited land uses and activities that pose a hazard to the city's CARAs are listed in RZC 216450C, though they are not similarly identified within Article 1 chapters. Staff identified the need for cross-references from RZC chapters 2110, 2113, and 2114 to RZC 2164 50C, which lists the prohibited land uses in the CARAs. However, I have not seen an amendment to correct a flaw in 2164-50C. Its subsection 1 lists 25 prohibited land uses and activities in CARA 1, but subsection 2 lists only 2 prohibited land uses and activities in CARA 2. CARAs 1 and 2 lie over the same aquifer. The only difference between CARA 1 and CARA 2 is in CARA 1, it takes up to 5 years for groundwater contamination to reach city-owned public water wells. In CARA 2, it takes more than 5 years for groundwater contamination to reach those wells. Contaminating the groundwater in CARA 2 is as bad for water quality and public health as contaminating the groundwater in CARA 1. All 25 of the prohibited land uses and activities in CARA 1 should also be prohibited in CARA 2. The City of Redmond has a pollution prevention assistance agreement with the State Department of Ecology. The program's mission is to safeguard residents and the environment by helping small businesses reduce toxic chemical usage, safely manage hazardous waste, and prevent stormwater pollution. As part of the agreement, Redmond will conduct site visits to businesses that may potentially pollute groundwater within its CARAs to conduct risk-based assessments. The Redmond zoning code could require that businesses wishing to locate on Redmond's CARAs first be proactively assessed through this program for their risk of potential groundwater contamination. To avoid contaminating its drinking water aquifer, Redmond might consider the following. First, establish stricter zoning regulations for CARAs, ensuring that high-risk activities such as industrial and chemical storage facilities are prohibited within these areas. Implement setback requirements to keep development a safe distance from aquifer recharge zones. Second, require comprehensive environmental impact assessments for any development proposed in CARAs, including hydrogeological studies, soil testing, and potential contaminant modeling to evaluate the impact on groundwater quality. Developers should be obligated to fund and adhere to mitigation measures. Third, incentivize low-impact development, or LID, techniques within CARAs, such as permeable pavements, green roofs, and stormwater retention systems to reduce runoff and minimize pollutants entering the aquifer. Fourth, implement stringent monitoring and reporting requirements for existing and new developments in CARAs. Regular inspections should be conducted to ensure compliance with environmental safeguards. And lastly, educate the public to increase awareness of the importance of CARAs and the need for their protection. Stakeholders, including residents, businesses, and environmental organizations, should be engaged in the zoning code amendment process. Through proper amendment of the zoning code, Redmond can fortify its commitment to preserving its drinking water aquifer and maintaining the long-term sustainability of this vital resource. Thank you.
Next, we have Evan L.
Okay.
Evan Lawler, 8347 Medway Lane, Bainbridge Island, 98110. I'm here tonight on behalf of Goodman Real Estate. We are the owner, developer, and builder of a new multifamily community at 124th and Willows in the Northwest Design District. Our new community, which we're looking to deliver in the early part of 2024, includes a retail component of 22,000 square feet. And getting a great retail tenant is critical to the success of our building and the community in the Northwest Design District. We're aware of the comp plan, rezone master plan process that Quadrant entered into in 2018 to create with you the Northwest Design District zoning. And when we entered into that community with Quadrant, we understood that the commercial component was going to be required of us to complete for the multifamily building. And we reviewed the list of allowed uses and thought they were generally complementary to our building and the community. Right now, our commercial brokers are telling us that the highest and best demand for our retail space is medical office use, and that's at a neighborhood scale. Dentists, local clinics, things of that nature have shown strong interest in our space. In reviewing the specifics of the allowed uses in the Northwest Design District, we were surprised to see that daycares, veterinarian offices, nail salons, other business and professional services are permitted outright, but surprisingly, a medical office is not. So, you can have your teeth whitened, but not cleaned in our building. Your dog can get a shot, but your kids can't. So we think maybe that wasn't the exact intent of the Northwest Design District. We understand that doctors' offices, dentists are grouped in with institutional health and service, which also encompasses, hospitals and, larger high-intensity sort of medical uses. And certainly we're not striving for that. So what we're here tonight to hopefully clarify with you all is some idea or process by which we can include these neighborhood scale medical office uses in the Northwest Design District to be complementary of, sort of the complete neighborhood, complete community philosophy. We've worked with Courtney Flora at McCullough Hill, Larry, who has the long history with this project and the rezone and the creation of the NWDD. And it's her opinion that when the NWD was created, small neighborhood medical office use wasn't intended to be excluded, and so we're just looking for a little clarity on that. So we're asking that as part of the cleanup process that you're working on here tonight, that maybe we can look at correcting that oversight, allowing appropriate medical office, scalable for the residential community that we're creating there to be included. We look forward to delivering this community, welcoming new residents, and hopefully having a high quality retail commercial tenant in our space soon. So thank you for considering our request.
Thank you.
Next, we have Katie K.
Hello, I'm Katie Kendall. I think most of you know who I am, 701 Fifth Avenue with McCullough Hill. I'm actually standing, imagine I'm Courtney Flora today. She wasn't able to make it today, so I'm speaking on her behalf. So as Evan kind of alluded to, I think Courtney may be the last person standing on the city side or the client side that was part of this Northwest Design District creation. And really the intention that was involved in it, I know there's people in the city that have been here quite much longer than that. The intention of that, though, was to carry over the BP uses, because this was formerly zoned business park, the BP uses that made sense, and also allow standalone housing. And, the city deliberately excluded manufacturing, wholesale trade, and regional uses, but included the retail, professional, and personal services uses that Evan just mentioned as well. I think it's clear when you kind of look at the uses and what was allowed and what isn't, that medical office and dental offices clearly were part of the intent of the creation of the Northwest Design District. And now medical office does fall into the ambulatory and outpatient services use category that was in place in 2018. That name of that use category that was in place in 2018 doesn't imply medical office and dentist. When you kind of think about it, you think hospital, right? And so the intent of having the office is there, not the hospital. And so we're asking you today to look at including this as part of the cleanup bill to codify the intent of the creation of Northwest Design District. One of the things the city had asked us to do, and it's part of the letter that was submitted to Courtney, and I believe that got to the commission as well, was look at the transportation impacts. Does this create a transportation issue? So we actually did ask Transpo to compare the trip generation associated with the uses contemplated in the master plan, which was 9,000 square foot of office, 8,500 square feet of daycare, and 5,000 square feet of retail, as compared to a 22,000 square foot medical office use. And what Transpo found is that the trip generation associated with the medical office use would be less than what was evaluated in the master plan. And that memo is attached to the Courtney's letter as well. In closing, adding medical office as a proposed use in the Northwest Design District is appropriate for the code cleanup ordinance. It's a clarifying amendment and does not represent a material change to the Northwest Design District, and I think fulfills the purpose of creating a complete neighborhood in that district. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And that is everyone who signed up.
Thank you. Okay, so at this point, I will close the public hearing for verbal testimony, but leave it open for the time being for written. Okay, so now we'll move into our study session.
I would like to call up the issues matrix that was generated at your last meeting, and that is in your meeting packet for today. There was one item identified by Commissioner Weston, and there were a few other questions, but I believe those were answered during the course of the meeting. So this one was a question about how to increase the transparency and awareness of fence requirements. So I took some time to look into this and talked with several staff from the Building Department, Development Services, and Code Enforcement. I also was able to pull information from what is called our Q Alert system, or our customer services database. And so that produced some information specific to fences. During the past 12 months, fences comprised 11 of 144 total issues that were assigned to the code enforcement team. And the reason that I isolated those is that fence complaints would typically be assigned to code enforcement. There were no other fence items in the database. Fences are codified as far as their design, particularly height, but also some type of transparency in some neighborhood plans. That is reviewed at the time of an application for development or significant remodel, but it is not reviewed on an ongoing basis once a development has occurred. It would be reviewed if a fence permit were required, and in that case, a fence over 7 feet now would require a building permit. There would not be a companion permit to review a fence from that land use and design perspective. It would not, for example, go to the design review board. It would not have a design review process, but it would be part of the building permit, and therefore an opportunity to look at the construction of the fence and make sure it was appropriate to the neighborhood. What I learned as well is that fence information is provided in several places on our webpage, several resources that are available. For example, providing one sheet on how fences are regulated by the city. If you want to modify or install a fence, that would be in another place called Fences and Decks, so you could obtain the correct permit. And then there's also sort of a companion piece, work exempt from permits, and this talks about when a fence would not need a building permit. That particular document is part of the building portion of planning versus the land use portion. There was one other section that I looked at, and that was frequently asked questions, which is something that a variety of web pages on our site are able to link to. And in this case, fences was not a piece of information available through that tool. So what staff noted in your issue matrix is that we agree that there are more opportunities to share information about fences, and the FAQs could be one of those places. The other is an opportunity that has yet to be scheduled, and that is improvement to our fence and retaining wall code. Now, that has not started, but that is something that we are looking at in our next round of code improvements. So additional work could be provided to clarify that section of code, 2116.030, 21.24. I believe those are the two. Oh, and also 2152.040 would be referenced because that involves site distance triangles for the correct location of fences.
Thank you so much for putting all of this together. So I think that this largely answered my questions. That Fences and Decks website page, like on the Redmond site, is exactly where I would love to see that information. So, like, not necessarily, I know that some of the parallel pages in that area do incorporate the FAQs, so if that's the easiest way to pull in that information, that seems great. But just having a single source where you can actually know that you're getting the right answer. I was still a little bit confused about the 6 feet versus 7 feet question, because you're not allowed to build more than 6 feet, but you don't need a permit until 7 feet, which seems confusing.
Yes, the permit is something that is coordinated with the state building code. Previously, they were the same height, but the building code was updated, I believe 2, maybe even 3 years ago now, and that height was increased. I don't know the source of the change, why it was increased, but it indicated at which point a building permit would review, or would be required. Now, it still doesn't change the neighborhood plans that have the specificity based on the specific neighborhood, 6 feet or 5 feet, whether there's a transparency requirement or not. That is reviewed at design, and it would again be for new construction or significant remodels.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's two different legs where fences get involved, and they do have different heights based on their purpose.
Yeah, for me, I think it makes a lot of sense to have the new construction piece. I was mostly seeing this through the lens of existing properties that have existing fences and need to replace them. So that's where I would really see incorporating that information on the fences and decks page being useful. But thank you so much for pulling this together.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So I think I'm ready to close.
Thank you.
That was the only issue on the
That was
issues
the only
matrix?
issue that was identified last week. I would enjoy hearing from the commission on the 2 topics that were presented this evening.
Okay. Go ahead.
I actually also have one additional topic on another one in here. In the beekeeping one, I would like to see that modified just very slightly to specify that we're talking about honeybees, not any of the native solitary bees. Because some of the things about eradicating bees and like the distance from the lot line could be used against mason bees or leafcutter bees, like bumblebees, like all the things that people encourage for gardening. The pollinators that aren't aggressive, don't sting, don't group together. So just making sure that there isn't an avenue for people to accidentally mistake this code for something where they're going after a native pollinator. And it especially applies to Part G of the beekeeping, where you're actually talking about eradication.
Okay.
Okay, I've got that. I will need to coordinate with our code enforcement is one group I could think about, but I would also like to coordinate with our natural resource staff, who's now utilities and environment, because I'm not certain how much that particular piece of code, which originated from King County Animal Control, how much that piece of code needs to mirror county and/or state. But I will look into that and provide more information.
Yeah, the two I'm specifically worried about are Part G, where you're talking about eradication, like through pest control, and then the second part is the lot lines, because it's within 25 feet, which covers a fair amount of space.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Aparna?
Thank you, Chair. So I'm not sure if we would like, I'm just asking all the commissioners here whether we would like to put the comments that we heard from the public on the issue matrix.
You don't have to poll all the commissioners. If you want to put it on the issues
I think
matrix.
it would be nice to
You can
have
put
at
it on the
least a
commission.
response on this one, on the Proctor Willow project. As to the Kara comment, I understand that this is just linking the two, and the Kara details will come in the land use element and other sections upcoming, but we will hold on to the comments for later. As in, I will hold it, not you. Yeah, so if you could just add that and have a response on whether that's an allowed use and clarify that, that'd be great.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I understand what you're saying, that I think what we had heard in the past is that Mr. Morton's concerns were going to be addressed with the cross-referencing, and he doesn't seem to think that that's the case. So that's what I think that we would want a follow-up on.
Yes, Mr. Morton and I have had several opportunities when these amendments were being drafted to discuss several of his points, though there is new information that he brought forward this evening. What I would like to do with that information is to communicate with our Utilities Division again and to identify whether there's anything that could be addressed as part of a minor cleanup to the code, if there are any needs that they see in comparison to the list he provided, but also for those that aren't able to be considered as part of a minor amendment. And what I mean by minor is that a SEPA has been issued for this packet of amendments, and anything that would not be covered by that SEPA would then require additional analysis, additional SEPA, and then returning to the Planning Commission with a new packet. At the same time, you will be receiving information soon with proposals for critical areas for the natural environment. There are many things that are coming that would have a scope and an environmental impact statement or a SEPA that could potentially cover the comments that Mr. Morton provided. So I would like to come back to you in your next issue matrix and provide that information, basically a roadmap to identify the next steps for these points.
Yeah, I will add, I can't remember if Commissioner Parno was on the commission when we did the Proctor Willows property to begin with, but it certainly wasn't anything we discussed on commission about prohibiting that kind of use. Okay, well, I guess I was the only one, but I remember this, I remember all of our discussions, and it was never something that we intended to prohibit, so. I would definitely like to see that.
Would it be possible for staff to provide information on the request to include the ambulatory services in the allowed uses?
Yeah.
So we have had opportunity to review, and particularly in light of the transportation study, staff is supportive of the change. In reviewing the record that led to the creation of that particular zoning district, it was unclear whether the applicant at the time or staff or both understood that ambulatory services would not be part of that allowed use suite. So with that, and recognizing that it is a lesser impact use than what is allowed today, then staff does not have any concerns with including that allowance. What I would like to do is to look at the loud use category to make certain that the specifics of what the applicant is asking for are provided, and we don't inadvertently provide something that is beyond that transportation impact. So we will follow up on that tomorrow with the applicant and provide you the specific response in your issues matrix.
Yes, I appreciate that. Anything else for this issues matrix? Okay.
Okay, thank you
I
very
will
much.
continue to leave written comment open, and we'll follow up in the next study
I
session.
do have one item. The next time you see this, I believe, is going to be a few weeks out. Did you want to leave the written open until that time or to a date certain?
Until that time.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now we'll move on to a study session on Redmond 2050 downtown and community design policies, first draft. And we'll welcome Becky to the table.
Good evening, Commissioners. So this evening, we are covering just the downtown policies, draft 1.0, and the community design policies, draft 1.0. They are parts of the larger community design chapter that it will include all of the centers, corridors, and community design, historic preservation, et cetera. So in your memo, I put the outline of everything that was actually in this chapter and showed where these two pieces fit in. There is more work to come. So tonight, we're going to just briefly cover a reminder of the development process, is how we got to the policies. We're going to do some policy review, start that tonight, get as far as we can. And then we're going to go through a couple of next steps. This comic illustration here is just one of the things that, as we look at community design, it was just a really good example of how, if we think for everybody, it works for everybody. If we think for just one person, excluding. So it's just added in there for some comic relief and policy setting. So as with every other time you have seen the first draft of policies, we're providing these context slides. Just a reminder, we did a lot of community outreach at the kickoff. We did a lot of visioning and work on our themes and how are we going to integrate everything. We did a whole series of policy considerations so that we can figure out how we were going to move forward on all of these, and included a significant amount of community engagement on policy options and alternatives, and that all led to the drafting that you see this evening. We are going to keep going. Obviously, it's just the very beginning. It's the first look at the first draft. There is a significant amount of community engagement that happens between the first and second draft. So don't be surprised if we get to the second draft and we see changes, especially on the community design piece. Some of the policy consideration work that happened in the previous steps included that look at community character, neighborhood character, looking at design standards and how we can better integrate the themes of equity, inclusion, sustainability, resiliency. Definitely looking at some of the specific unique needs of Marymore as well, and the native cultures, and just in general, recognizing how the different cultures in our community can impact community design. From a land use perspective, some of the policy considerations included relationship to the transit-oriented development and the station area planning, and also looking at removing barriers to non-residential, but specifically office construction in downtown in particular, and also reviewing how the city looks at FAR, the floor area ratio, regulations and policies. So if you remember, maybe about a month and a half ago, we had a really quick refresher on FAR, but if that comes up again, we'd be happy to share that. I know it's something that gets lost sometimes. So again, what we did included what we refer to as our modern scan, including for anything that's out of place, anything that doesn't belong in the comp plan, but also maybe belonging in a different chapter, anything that's out of date, anything that's just sounds weird or is really hard to interpret. So all of that type of evaluation happened really early on. Just what do we do to edit what we have? Then we also had to look at what are the new requirements from regional planning, state legislative changes, all of those things. What are things that we've adopted in between when we had our last plan, including the Environmental Sustainability Action Plan, some of the other policy directions that we've been going. So all of this work went into some of the other things that we're doing and also led to the draft policies. So the questions for you tonight include the same questions, again, that we ask every time we have a first draft of the policies. Do you feel that we are supporting the Redmond's vision and goals? Are we aligning with the Redmond 2050 themes? Do you feel like we've missed anything? Is there anything that you expected to see here that we don't see yet? And just the general, are we on the right track? So if you keep those questions in mind as we go through the policies, that would be helpful. And then before we actually start diving into the individual pieces and parts, want to just talk about some of the next steps. After we go through some of the policies, if you want to come back to this, we'll be happy to. But moving forward into the rest of this year, there's a lot of community conversations that will be happening specifically around community design, equity, inclusive design conversations, especially with our community-based organizations. There's a lot of conversations about new policies and code revisions specifically, and then integration with the Redmond zoning code rewrite work that Kim is doing on design guidelines as well. So there's work that she's undertaking for the actual building specific, especially the exterior of the building. And the work that we're doing under Redmond 2050 is looking at broader questions about how do we build a community that is designed for everyone. So they are definitely integrated very closely together and will influence each other. So some of these slides, for those who have been on the commission a little bit longer, might find these familiar because this is a part of some of the initial slides that we did. But with several new planning commissioners, we thought before we start diving into a lot of these questions, we'd provide the information so everybody's on the same page and has the same information. From an inclusive design standpoint, we're looking a lot about the process and the people. So looking at all the different demographic differences in our community, age, language, gender, culture. We're looking at what the community members themselves need and looking at a lot of different ways that we can present that information, including and super easy to read and understand, taking a look at language in particular. So the inclusive design is that process. It talks about that diversity, the demographic differences of our community. Whereas universal design is the actual built environment. So it's everything from our homes, our landscapes, the buildings themselves, the architecture. It's how we construct that built environment to make sure that it's accessible to every person regardless of their age and ability. Everybody's on the same plane. There's no person that's lesser than another. So everybody's equally considered from the construction standpoint. So that's how we've been using the terms during this process. As you go online, you might see several different definitions the same way. If you go on, look for equity definitions, you'll see thousands of them. But this is how we've been using those terms in this context. Also, as we look at inclusive design and inclusive built environment, who are we talking about? So in specific, these are just some examples. So we definitely know our community is very concerned about community members of all ages, especially as in our urban forums, conversations about what do we do with children and teens in high rises, for instance, or in overlay, what the spaces are they going to use? Safety for children is different than other considerations. So making sure that we're inclusive to all ages, all genders. Obviously, women have different safety concerns or spatial needs, or they're generally the ones that are pushing the stroller, not always, but they have different needs from a building design standpoint. Folks who are LGBTQ+, they might have different spatial needs or safety needs. Children who, they're designing children play spaces. You design them differently for girls than boys because they are sized differently, or how they might want to hang out and the activities they might want to do are different. Making sure that we're just considering all the different uses of our spaces and how they are designed. Cultural is pretty self-explanatory. There's lots of different cultural space needs that is brought up consistently in our outreach with our community. Different cultural spaces, indoor, outdoor, small, big. Abilities is also pretty straightforward, just accessing irregardless of your physical or mental ability. Income levels, making sure that everybody has the same access or opportunity might be a little bit different if we're taking into consideration how we design our spaces and places and access. So something that's come up recently is times for businesses and access to transit. We frequently hear they might have jobs that end later at night, and trying to get back to town when the buses or light rail isn't operating makes them be forced to have a car. So there's different types of things that different level of incomes might have spatial needs related to that. Third shift, 18-hour city, it's same thing. We've talked a lot about making sure, especially Overlake, is more of an around-the-clock type of community, but the spatial needs of an around-the-clock type of community might be different, and those third shift workers might also have slightly different needs but they also need to access those at different times. So how do we operate our physical environment in such a way that everybody is treated equally and has equal opportunity? So these are just some examples of things that have come up in our community engagement as the community has identified things that might impact how we build our community. So again, it's inclusive in a lot of different ways. That's just an example. There's a couple of examples here in the slide deck. I'm not going to go through these. I just wanted to be able to have them out there for you to look through. Lots of different ways, different examples from universal design, some questions that we are going to be asking for the community. How do you feel welcome? How do you feel safe? How do you feel friendly in the space? How do we make sure that we're meeting the needs of our historically marginalized or underrepresented groups spatially? That's something that has been hard to define, and we're going to have some conversations in particular with our CBOs, our community organizations around that. There's some examples in here. I'm just going to flash this really quick so we can get into the policy review. But after the slide deck at the bottom, there's a lot of resources for you. On a Monday, it was asked about the design process. So there's a slide in here that talks about design review and the different pieces and parts. Kim and I will work on coming back to you at a follow-up conversation with the Planning Commission to talk to you a little bit more about the work we're doing on design review, updates to the process itself, the recent legislative changes about design and design policies and regulations. So just to let you know, there's a slide deck in here that talks about our current process, but we'll come back to you and talk to you more deeply about that as you look at policies so you can better understand the implementation side of things. There's also a significant number of slides. I do want to point out a couple here. The East Side for All Padlet is a really great resource. We have also been working really closely with the Northwest Universal Design Council. They have a ton of resources on their website as well. But if you're interested in something in specific, we have a lot of placemaking, about diversity, autism-friendly, neurodiverse, all of these different types of resources. If you're interested in something in specific, there's a ton of resources here as well and some additional examples. So they're in the slide deck so that they're available for the community members and the planning commissioners if there's something in particular you'd like to dive a little bit deeper in there for you. So any questions before we dive into the policy work?
Commissioner Aparna.
Becky, I think the resources are awesome. Thank you. Because I think it works as a library for us to understand, like, I'm a little familiar with it, but not everybody is. So it's really nice to understand the possibilities. And I think we can all visualize the kind of world we want to head towards in terms of more inclusion. It's not just a word, you know? So thank you.
Welcome. We're going to be looking to put these on the website as well. So especially as we start to dive more deeply into the community conversations about inclusion, making it easier for people to get access to these resources. Not in the PDF of here, but we'll have a page for that. If you have any resources that you would like to add, obviously there's tons of resources out there. If there's something specific that you'd like to add, just please let me know and I'll make sure that gets on the page that I've put together for that. Anything else? Are we ready to dive into downtown policies?
Let's go for it.
There we go. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I'm just starting on page 2 of the attachment because page 1 just is more of a table of contents and explanation of what's in here. So what I will do today is I'll use the comment feature to add any other conversations from the Planning Commission tonight, and then we'll use your comments for the revisions that come forward. The first section in the downtown policy, DT1, is being deleted, actually DT2 as well. These are one of those misplaced pieces that are duplicative in an extent of, we have this chapter called public participation. So these first two ones, they're not necessarily disappearing because we don't value them anymore. They're just an example of something that exists in elsewhere, and we're just trying to streamline the comp plan. So. And you'll see that happen quite a bit. And if you recall with Overlake, that happened a lot as well. So there are several chapters where that has a significant impact on it. So then we just dive directly into land use. So we have updated DT3, obviously not significantly in the sense of how long it is, but we want to make sure it reflects the accommodating growth. And as you can see here, we're streamlining the land use and zoning districts. So we want to make sure that we're not referencing the existing today's zoning districts because we're moving away from those. As you recall, we're going from 12 downtown zoning districts to 3-ish as we make that determination. So we don't want to reference the current zoning districts moving forward. So it does still keep a lot of the same intent. We're still focusing really on civic and cultural anchoring. You'll see that we are still referencing the historic area called Old Town because that is not necessarily a zoning district only, that is a historic area. And we do reference the new downtown edge, downtown core, and town center because those are something that we'll continue to move forward with. But it also then clarifies that those downtown edge areas are the transitions. So you'll start to see how they blend into the surrounding neighborhoods. And we do emphasize that town center is next to the new light rail station. So it's intended to be a more vibrant area. So any questions or comments on the revisions to DT3?
Commissioner Aparna.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Becky. So I just had a question. I know that the older version referenced the river trail and so on. In this, it's omitted, given the connector, given the river trail. I don't know whether we want, I know it's mentioned elsewhere in other policies, but since you're just kind of defining the boundary, wouldn't it be nice to have, it doesn't really mention that.
Let's see. It mentions River Bend, which is a zoning district, and it mentions River Trail, which is a zoning district. So
Yeah,
the
it's in a
River
different
Trail
policy.
reference in the old policy is actually the zoning district reference, not to reference to the actual trail system.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then the other question was, I think what's missing in this first one is a sort of definition of, how do I put this? Bad wordsmithing on my part, okay? It's just basically, just a minute, let me just get the exact document out, I apologize. So when we have the first statement about downtown core as a civic and cultural heart of Redmond, somewhere in there is, the words which are missing is vibrant living. You know, so the idea being that we are calling out, eventually we call out the 18/7 deal. So that kind of, I think it would be nice to say something about vibrance and like a nonstop living kind of deal. And in the town center piece, and I think we discussed this when we had that town center discussion last December. If we look at the town center by where it is located, the name, and what a big part it plays right now, it may not always be so, but it should be something like that area becomes symbolic of what Redmond has to offer. And again, symbolism is missing in terms of like either a landmark or something which is substantial as a design and a development. I don't know if there are qualifiers that need to be put here, but it is, when you're defining it, it's, to me, when you say downtown, it's not just these pockets, it's what it symbolizes, right? I don't know if everybody else agrees, but so that's what's got to pop off of this page, I mean, this first policy, I think.
Okay, well, I'll have to noodle on that. But if something pops to you about a specific wording that you'd like to see, feel free to email it.
Like a central hub, because it is central. Overlake being, if it's the other center, it's still on the edge of the city, right? So if you look at what would be the spirit of Redmond, Overlake is one type of spirit which we kind of share with our partners in Bellevue, but it is, the downtown will be uniquely ours.
I'll add that in here.
From an identity perspective, right? So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I don't know if it's too fluffy, but yeah. Sorry.
Well, when Lauren reads the notes from tonight, she's on the East Coast, so I'm covering her for downtown tonight. But if she has any further questions, I will have her connect with you. So.
Yeah, I was going to say, Becky, just building on what Aparna was saying, it would be curious to know like how other communities kind of, the language that they use to capture the spirit.
I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
I'd be curious to know like how other communities like Bellevue and Kirkland address the same issue in terms of capturing the spirit of the downtown area, like what the types of language that they use. Because I'm not a fan of fluffiness, but I am a fan of really capturing the whole spirit of what we're trying to achieve in the downtown community.
I will put that in there. Okay. I will have some conversations with other planning staff. Thank you. Anything else on DT3? Okay, let's keep going. All right, there's a couple of new ones coming in. You'll see a new one about accommodating growth, maintain development regulations for downtown that accommodate job and housing growth. This is pretty straightforward. It's based off of our requirements. We have to have a statement in there. It does specifically relate to more than just job and housing, and that's because in our conversations around Overlake and the centers, we talked about that. So it has a little bit more in here. I think, Aparna, when we were looking at the Overlake statement in particular, you were talking a little bit about all of those pieces. So any comment about this first new one here? Okay. The second one is just in support of the work that we've been doing for economic development and maintaining our small local businesses. And so the new policy there would be support economic development measures that retain and promote existing businesses and attract new businesses compatible with the scale and vision for downtown. Again, this is very, very similar to one we did for Overlake, where the Planning Commission had said, we don't need to just focus on attracting new businesses. We need to have our policies reference both new and supporting the existing. And that has been a big push for the last couple of years, is how do we support those small local businesses. Any comments here? Go ahead.
I think the spirit is right. I'm not sure about the words, because attract new businesses and attract new businesses compatible with the scale and vision for downtown. So for me, that means all the tinier businesses and the one-story kind of situations. Are we not, like, it shouldn't feel that we're excluding them because the scale's going to go up. It's reading that way.
Okay.
I know that's not the intent, so.
Commissioner Nueva Camino.
Commissioner Aparna, thank you for bringing that up, because I agree with that, because when we're talking about different small vendors being, when we're talking about smaller vendors and smaller businesses being included around some of the festivals around Downtown Park, if we were to have a vendor come in that has a cart business, whether it's like popsicles in the summertime or whatever, something that does not have the same permitting required as a food truck does, and shutting down streets and all that and getting fire department involved, then this could be exclusive of that. And again, I don't think that that's in the spirit of it, but there's been so many other areas where the staff has done such a phenomenal job. Becky, thank you for the first draft, because there's some areas where it got really clear. It became quite flexible and very inclusive. But I think that we could do just a little bit more to be more inclusive on what small business is. Thank you.
I guess I read this completely opposite, which was this was compatible with the scale and vision for downtown, was that we were not looking to bring in another Microsoft or another, that we're looking to make it more around smaller businesses, not huge corporations. Mr. Weston.
So I think this is so interesting because I can flip it both ways. I think that the wording compatible with the vision for downtown is specifically, like, it's not very measurable, like it's not very specific. So if we could just clarify that piece, I think that would, I think that's the problem. Like depending which it's almost like a Rorschach test. Like you can come in and see it either way, depending what you are expecting to see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So the next couple of policies you'll see here, DT4 and 5, they're being deleted. They were not necessary anymore. They're in either, this first one, encourage advanced technology sector it's covered in a lot of things that we talk about in our economic development chapter. DT5 is not needed because we have that general policy that talks about planned growth for each of our centers. So both of those policies are recommended for deleting. For DT6, we are just doing a couple of updates in there. It is trying to focus it around the conversation about infill and redevelopment, and not necessarily as much around the boundaries. But you'll see it still maintains, encourage the natural landscaping, et cetera. It just kind of streamlines it a little bit.
Go ahead.
So I think it reads fine, but what I see is a common theme where we are trying to encourage connections with the downtown and within the downtown, whether it is pedestrian, whether it is the trail system, whether it is transit into downtown or access to downtown, whether it's the interstitial spaces between the developments. There's a whole bunch of these, right? So I think it could be that it's scattered, so the concept of connections in downtown could be its own policy if it works. I don't know. It's just the way I read it is I see the common theme and they could all be clubbed together in a different way. But that's just me. It's just a sidebar thought, okay? But because you see this in several policies.
Okay.
So.
Nope, that's a valid comment, thank you. And I think as we continue through this, if you see something where it might be a better fit to move that second sentence down and combine it, we'll make that note. Okay. Any other comments on DT6? Okay.
No.
All right, so DT38 has been moved around a little bit. You'll see the numbering jumps. So reorganization is part of a lot of the work that we're doing. So just trying to shorten this a little bit, but just again, maintaining the fact that we're looking at both vertical and horizontal mixes of uses. This has come up a lot frequently because now that development is seeing another tightening of banking restrictions, it's really hard to get mixed use financed in some cases. Some lenders are getting a little strict again. And so sometimes mixed use works better if it's completely separate buildings, but it's integrated in the mixed use development. So maintaining policies that make it very clear that when we're talking about mixed use, it doesn't have to be integrated in one building has been really important. So minor change here, but it does reinforce and help support some conversations that the development community has been pointing out lately.
I think what you said is much clearer than encourage vertical and horizontal mixes. Because when I read encourage vertical and horizontal mixes, I don't know what that means.
Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts on that one as well, though? Okay. All right. So this next one, minor updates as well, provide a variety of land use options. We did keep in that it's market-driven. I don't necessarily know if we need to keep that market-driven because it'll be market-driven no matter what. But it is just, again, looking at residential and non-residential development. So,
Yeah, I'm not sure market-driven needs to be in there.
I'm sorry?
I'm not sure market-driven needs to be in there.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Any other thoughts on this one? Okay. All right. DT40 is just kind of reflecting the new changes that we're doing, just again, streamlining it a little bit. You'll see the intent is pretty similar to what we had before, encouraging the retention, location expansion. It just streamlines it a little bit.
Susan?
This isn't one where one of our comments tonight was really pertinent. I would really like to see medical and dental offices called out as uses, because a lot of the current medical and dental downtown is in older buildings that are probably likely to be redeveloped. And so I really want to make sure that there's somewhere for all of those professionals to go once they're redeveloped.
Okay.
Like medical and dental is all in older buildings right now. So like if I want an eye doctor appointment, or if I like,
I'm sorry, my hearing is so bad. Want to make sure I understand the comment, so I note it down right. The listing of specific uses.
Well, I guess the question is, does professional include medical, dental, eye doctor?
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, that we need to ask.
yeah, orthodontist,
Thank you.
therapist.
Sorry.
I don't know.
It's hard to hear in this room.
Because as
really-
Susan points out, there are a lot of dentists in Redmond, and many of them are in older buildings that are likely to be redeveloped. And
And
we
if you-
want to keep our dentists.
Absolutely. And if you can't go in Redmond right now, Bellevue has the same issue.
Yeah.
So we're like regionally, this is also a problem. So I'd really like to see that specifically preserved in downtown.
Yeah, the dentist I use, the endodontist I use, the oral surgeon I used are all in buildings that are likely to be redeveloped, and they're all in Redmond.
Okay. Well, Kim has stepped out, but if she steps back in, we can ask her from these. She's the expert on
Yeah,
that one.
Particularly in light of the discussions we had earlier tonight about what was and was not,
Right. I just want to make sure that is specifically called out as
Right.
something we want to keep.
I do know it's really funny you mentioned dentist office, because that is something that we've heard. We have people are complaining that every little dentist office, there's too many of them. So
right?
it's
You give up your
interesting.
dentist first.
Yeah. So, it's like, save the space for something more interactive. Yeah. So, any other comments on this? Okay, but we'll follow up on the uses, and
Yeah.
so thank you. Okay, DT 37, we're updating our pedestrian orientation conversations, right? How we talk about the public realm and how we talk about pedestrian orientation. As we started the conversation with Overlake, this public realm conversation includes bicycles, right? So you asked us to include a lot of that with Overlake. We're just continuing the parallel construction of including the bicycle conversation with pedestrian orientation. So it now reads, encourage redevelopment that provides desirable mid-block streets with bicycle access and pedestrian supportive streetscapes to improve pedestrian safety and urban character. There's probably 30,000 different ways to say this. If you'd like, any other comments on this?
Mr. Shefford?
Just have a quick, I guess I just want to follow up on something that Perna said earlier, and I think this touches on it in terms of the importance of connections. So I think you're touching upon that here. And I don't know if this falls in the transportation element, but the importance of bicycle racks or bicycle parking options. And I don't know where that would fall necessarily, because this suggests movement, but is there an opportunity for, bike
Okay.
racks? Where should that be placed? And again, I don't know if this is the right location, but I just wanted to bring it up.
I missed that last part.
I don't know if this is the right policy to bring this up, but I just wanted to make it.
Okay. We'll keep that in mind as we keep kind of scrolling through, but I'll add it in here. Is this?
Just want to propose for that comment specifically, when we get to CC 26, I think it would be a really good fit there.
Did you say DC?
CC 26.
Hi, just want to say the mics are not picking up super well tonight, so if we can make sure that we're speaking like right into these rascals, that would be appreciated.
And I do apologize. Part of it's I'm partially deaf in one ear, so it's, when they're not working really well, I miss some of what you're saying, so I apologize for that.
One of the things that isn't really captured in the new DT 37 that's in the old is about desired basic retail goods and services such as groceries and pharmacies are retained or provided in the affected redevelopment area. It doesn't really fit with what we've got, but is that something we want to capture somewhere else, or? It's right here.
Okay. That might be something that we need to retain, but maybe move up to DT 40, up
Yeah,
right above.
maybe, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's an important context, is that we need all of that type of services in downtown as well.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Any other comments on DT 37? Okay. Thank you. All right, so this next section is, we're deleting a header, not the entire section. So the Redmond Central Corridor is just going to be a header that gets deleted. Clarify that. DT 7, we are deleting this particular policy. There is another place where this conversation occurs. So we are moving a couple of other policies. It's the reason why the header's being deleted. Some things are being moved around. So DT8 is being moved out. That's the phasing plan. There's some other things that will need to be updated with that. And then DT9 is also being moved as well. So you'll see this conversation reoccur when we get back into the community character and design conversations. We are deleting DT10. Around future light rail stations, we have a lot of conversations now that they're here. We don't necessarily need a future-ready policy anymore. So we do have some general policies related to character and design. Just want to highlight that some of the work that is going to happen between the first draft and the second draft is also going to be taking a look at how these all chapters integrate with each other. So some of this may move or be consolidated with other policies. We're still kind of in the middle of trying to figure out what this new chapter and how they all mush together and how that works out. So if you see something in here that you think should be a citywide policy, or if you think it should be in this design, we'll go ahead and make that note. And as we go into phase 2, draft 2 of these documents, you'll see some of that migration and merging will happen. Just wanted to point that out because we know that's still a work in progress. But we're going to start off with a high-level, broad policy related to design specific to downtown, encouraging creative, diverse, context-sensitive designs, welcome and inclusive, support active transportation, create a lively center. So live, work, and play.
Which sounds like should be for all the centers, not just downtown.
Any other thoughts on that? I do think it's similar to something that we've seen. Is there anything in particular that you think if we worded a little differently would be a little bit more specific to downtown? Or do you think that just having that as a general centers-wide policy is good enough for here?
I think this would be a really good spot for Commissioner Aparna's original comment about the feel of downtown and how that's really, like, that's a place to capture what makes Redmond, Redmond.
Yeah, if we want to have sort of a definition of what is unique about downtown.
And then maybe actually move this up above
Right.
to the very top, so it's not buried, first of all, so it's not buried, and then second of all, so that when we're talking about the three parts that comprise downtown, they make a little more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's a very good point. Okay.
So this is a policy that applies to all the centers, and then each center has a policy that is, this is what this center, this is what's unique about this center. This is what makes this center what it is.
Okay, great. And we have in the centers-wide policy, there is one policy that just talks, like, there's a one-sentence
Yeah.
bullet.
Yeah.
Okay, in Overlake, it's like this thing, and downtown, it's a little different over here.
Right.
Then Marymore, we're going to add a bullet point. So
Yeah.
that might be a way as we start to look at
Yeah.
how we're
all
integrating the
fits
downtown
together.
and Marymore work. We can take a look at that particular policy in specific and then integrate the language
Yeah.
all together.
So,
I think that talked a little more about the design, like the overall feel, but this is, I think, a little more identity, so they're connected, but they're not the same.
right. It's not just geography
Yeah.
that defines what.
It's not like an obvious aesthetic thing, right? I mean,
Thank you for saying that, because I think that's really helpful. We were talking a little bit about trying to clarify, for instance, there's some things about the centers that have to go in land use, right? We need those things, but we don't necessarily want to have overlapping conversations, but we're running into the same thing with the centers pieces too, and the individual pieces and parts. So I think that's really helpful to me. I can get my head wrapped around the identity piece belongs within the center's conversations. And then anything related to design and all of those pieces belongs in the design section. And then that may change then a lot of these policies and where they go in draft 2.0, but that's extremely helpful from a how do we not overlap these conversations perspective. So thank you.
Right, because identity is not really land use. It's not.
Yeah. But believe it or not, there's quite a bit.
Yeah.
So Ian and I were just talking about that earlier today, so.
Yep.
Okay, but speaking of things that could potentially move, so DT11, we'll have some conversations about from a character, building height is something that is brought up quite a lot for downtown in particular. Some people, a few people want to go really tall, and the vast majority of public comment for the last 2 years has been concerns about going too tall in downtown. So having that conversation about height is going to come up. So the next one is DT12. It was deleted. It's been, as you note here, it's combined with 16. We'll get to that here in a minute. DT13 was also deleted. It's addressed in the historic preservation policies. DT9, it was something that's moved into this section. It is specific to the Redmond Central Corridor. It's slightly edited. So if we can review the content here, it's just ensuring the exterior remodeling that both sides of the Redmond Central Corridor is addressed. So any thoughts, comments on DT9?
When I read DT9 and DT20, there's a lot of similarities between them. In both cases, you're trying to, if you think of the Central Connector as a park, which, there's always this question of trails and whether trails are parks or not, and it depends on how you're looking at them that day. But you're essentially trying to make sure that the boundaries of the parks, the developments are respectful of those boundaries. And so both DT9 and DT20 seem to be trying to do much the same thing, just with different parks.
I think adding on to that, I think, yeah, one is very good, both they're saying similar stuff on both. But the other thing is, effectively, you're saying that the built environment has to not only respect the boundaries of the connector, but also interact with it and allow others to interact with it also. So again, coming down the connections point, in the sense that what we are looking for, if you just step back a bit and not look at the individual pieces, is a connected downtown, connected to Seattle, connected to the river trail, connected with each other, connected to downtown park, and connected to river trail and the central connector. So it's primarily, you're looking at one big connected mass, right, with interesting playful spaces in the middle. So it's like an urban design problem, but if you define it at the top level, that's what this is, right? So in fact, all these can be put together saying that good quality materials that open out to the spaces that encourage.
Your mic is off. Your mic is off.
All this while. Okay. Sorry about that, but how much did you guys miss? I was just so expansive. Everything? If you just, again, to reiterate, it's like an urban design problem at the highest level, where you're looking at, if you don't get into the specifics, it's masses interacting with each other, interacting with downtown Seattle to the transit hub, interacting with the parks, interacting with the bicycle lanes, the connector, the parks within and each other. So they have to be designed well to look outward and to look inward. So you encourage both. I
think that's helpful to me. I think what I can do, when I was in Frisco, we had policies related to this, and we talked about making sure that we're designing and amenitizing the spaces and how they relate to each other. And I think that's the direction we're trying to lead to here, is making sure that we don't just have these there, but they become a part of the integration of the design of the entire area, and we're fully taking advantage of them and amenitizing them.
Right. So integration and connection is how I would put a whole bunch of these, and just put the specific, okay, Redmond connector, and so on and so forth. But like, that's how I visualize Redmond downtown, that it's one flowing space, which is interesting, and it keeps changing, but it's all still like smooth transitions across the spaces.
Okay.
So I actually read these very differently. I love this because it's really helpful to have this sort of interplay and conversation. So when I read both of these policies together, and I agree, I think they're talking about similar things. What leapt to mind immediately is there are some developments when they're next to a public space, they get very private. So they kind of wall off from the public space. They put all of their unsightly stuff that they don't want out front on the public space. And so basically the way I read this is that you're trying to be a good neighbor. Like, we want these developments to be good neighbors, both on the street side and on the Parker Trail side. And we want, like, there shouldn't be a situation where a development, you cannot get to the trail because they didn't want access from the trail to their building. And so to me, this is it's actually saying don't allow hyperprotective development that seals itself off from these public spaces, or that just puts all their trash on the trail side or whatever. So I really want to make sure that piece is, I love the connectivity argument, but I saw this as being very protective against a style of development that doesn't feel good when you're using the trail and you're just seeing like fences and walls.
On a wall. Yeah, I agree that it's
And
trying
trash.
to do that. I just think it's trying to do it for both the central connector and all these parks, and I'm saying, let's just.
I completely agree with that.
I would agree with that. I would agree with that as well. The aesthetics is as important behind the building that's abutting the parks and the trails as it is the front.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important piece to the aesthetic, and I think also the accessibility, so not being blocked out,
Yeah.
not blocking public access to the parks.
Yeah, I think it again boils down to connections, but it's connections from within the building and outside of it. So, like, look at it as a close-knit family, but not too close-knit, right? And we
There's a
all have those.
permeability between
Yeah.
Yeah.
those
Yes,
spaces
there
and the
is.
surrounding
Right.
area.
And it's not just that, yeah, you've put your parking lot in the back there, and you can walk through the parking lot. It's an attractive,
Or your loading dock.
or your loading dock, yeah.
Yeah, I think it boils down to it being like I said, it's an urban design problem at the highest level, that it's one big thing that we're looking at and not disparate pieces. And I think that's what we kind of need to kind of focus on, is not just, the spirit of it would be one mass, but not quite, right? So.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
I was going to say, it kind of reminds me of like the problem that the city of Chicago had. I lived there for a couple of years where a lot of the policies were such that, you know, all the public park spaces and the waterway access was accessible to the public, and it wasn't like walled off by junk and, I'll call it junk. I'm sure they wouldn't call it junk, but walled off by like junk and, you know, debris. I call it debris, like things that pose a barrier to access, as well as things that detract from the aesthetic.
Yeah.
They've done a masterful job at that, so maybe, I don't know, that's an inspiration. Does that make sense? No?
Do you feel like the comments we put in here capture that, or do you want me to add anything related?
I'm not the best wordsmith. I think I'll leave it to Aparna, but I don't know that it fully captures that spirit.
Okay. All right. Back in. Well, we'll go back and I'll have Lauren listen to your conversation too. So it's not just my notes in here, but I'll have her listen to this particular, make sure we capture everything. This might be something that we'll just revisit maybe a couple different times as we start to look at how that works. I do think I got the gist of the direction the Planning Commission is talking about. And I think that some of the work that we're doing from a code standpoint, it fits really closely with what you're talking about from a policy standpoint. So I'll also probably pull Kim into this and we'll wordsmith it, make sure that we're capturing a lot of that. So, okay. All right. So DT 28, actually we reworded it a little bit longer than what it was. So maintaining and enhancing that pedestrian orientation streetscapes. And this gets a little bit more specific and it pairs with some of the work that we're doing on a code perspective. So part of what we need is we need a policy that is the foundation and base for the code work. So we're doing some of this work in parallel. We know the code work we're doing. We need a policy that matches and pairs with it. So we're talking about pedestrian and realm design standards and updates, and we're looking at attention to architectural details. We're talking about storefronts and all of those pieces and parts. So this policy was written by her to kind of in part be that foundational policy for the code update work that's happening.
I have I have trouble parsing this particular thing. I think it just probably needs to be broken up into a few more sentences, because I just have a hard time. Maintain and enhance pedestrian-oriented streetscapes with attention to architectural detail, and then components of the streetscape. I'm not quite sure how to fit that into the rest of the sentence. Continue, just the sentence just doesn't quite flow, and so it makes it hard for me to parse exactly what's being done there.
A period after streetscapes would help so much.
Right? Or, yeah, just,
I do know that there was a ton of edits, and maybe one of
Yeah.
the things that happened on this one might have been the accept changes, and then it just didn't
yeah.
make
somebody's
sense
got-
after
yeah.
accept changes.
Yeah, a few more, just a couple more connecting words and maybe break it up into a few more sentences.
Yeah.
Maybe,
So,
yeah.
or maybe this is one where it just needs to be a couple of sentences with bullet points underneath it,
Yeah,
just so
like
it's
that. Just 'cause
easier
I
to
just found it
read.
hard to parse
Yeah.
and figure out. I mean, I sort of know what's going on, but it's just hard to read.
I think also the second sentence there, the pedestrian activity can be enhanced. It feels out of place in a policy somehow. It feels
Yeah.
like it's not it's not reading as a policy to me. The first half reads like maintain and enhance, but then can be enhanced as methods, right? So I don't know, is that a policy thing? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Because it gets into like,
Enhanced pedestrian activity is a policy. How you do it is,
right, yeah, so I'm not sure if we just want the intent over here or the exact method, because none of the others get into that, so I'm not sure.
Okay, no, I think that is valid. We're trying to remove the regulatory side of things, include a few examples here and there, but not necessarily
Right.
get as bogged down into the specifics from a just general rewriting standpoint. That's valid, thank you.
Commissioner Wesson.
So before you delete that, I did have one clarification that I was curious about. So the no parking next to the sidewalk is really interesting to me because it does promote pedestrian access and a certain feeling in the city, but it doesn't match most of the new development. It would be a really sharp departure, actually, from a lot of the new development, because we do have a single lane for parking on a lot of city streets. I actually personally find that makes it easier to get around town a lot of the time, especially if I'm like hopping into a small business and then hopping out. There's a real tension here on parking. I don't know exactly the right answer, but I'm leery of saying all of downtown shouldn't have street side parking. That doesn't sound right to me.
It does to me. I want to make those bike lanes.
But then,
Protected bike lanes.
some other, I mean, I would love a parking garage and like a trolley that goes around. So you park once and then you just get to like hop on, hop off. That would be amazing. But like somewhere between where we are now and there, I think there still needs to be some capacity for car parking for people coming from outside of the walkable area.
I'll also follow up and ask her if she's intending this statement to be parking in front of the building, or is this all parking even if it's to the side of the building? Because parking next to the sidewalk doesn't necessarily speak to how it relates to where the building is on the site. So I'll ask for some clarification on that as well.
And maybe like surface lots, like I'm all for getting rid of more of those, but there's a difference between, I mean, the old town, part of downtown, you're not taking down these old buildings probably to add parking. So like there's just a, like, where do people actually go piece of this that I was left wondering about.
Okay. Anything else? Good? Okay.
Have a quick, just actually, I'm so glad that you brought that up. And I don't have the proper wording, but as I'm imagining the places that I've traveled, other parts of the world, et cetera, when you think about where people are parking, no matter how dense the urban core is, having parking in front of buildings also can kind of activate the streetscape. So I don't see it necessarily as a negative, it's just about how it's going to be done. And so it doesn't interfere with bicycle, or et cetera, et cetera. But I also think if you've got wide enough sidewalks, you've got landscaping, you've got these other sort of features that, again, activate the street and make it pedestrian friendly. You're also providing parking for these smaller businesses that that thrive on it, that really rely on having that accessible. So I guess I just find I'm a little challenged by the idea of doing away with it.
Okay.
I think the word activate is probably the word we should be using in this. She's absolutely right. I completely agree with Commissioner Sheffrin. Because when we say activate, it actually, you are encouraging and you're enhancing the experience, but you're also, it's like it's a boost, and it's a very, it means very specific things, which are all the things which are listed. So I really like the word.
Okay. Go ahead.
As I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about what is the current situation, and then I have to keep reminding myself that we're writing this not for the current situation, but forward thinking. Just want to throw that out there. So because that's what I'm wrestling with. I'm like, okay, well, what is the current situation with small businesses, and when we're activating the space, would that couple of parking spaces that we currently have, say, on Cleveland Avenue for one of the small businesses there, what is the turnaround of that compared to if there was, as that particular portion referred to, having parking structured parking to be hidden, which means adding the structured parking that doesn't currently exist. So then I'm like, okay, well, then how many customers is that going to bring, having a structured parking as opposed to the one or two parking spots that are in front of the building? Because it seems to me that there would be an increase in client flow, in pedestrian flow, if we've got structured parking as opposed to on the sidewalk.
Okay, so it sounds like this policy needs a little bit more of a thinking cap put on and how it goes. So I think that's good feedback. I'll have her, again, listen specifically to this conversation, and we'll integrate with our transportation folks who are looking at the work that we're doing for future conditions and how we do know things will change, and how is that. Great, thank you. Okay. DT 29 is just being deleted. Again, there's some other things that are being combined with. DT 41, here's where building height comes back up. So it's just being moved, regulating building height and design and open space. This is specifically talking about how downtown transitions. So any other thoughts, comments on this one?
No, but I do think we've been at this for about an hour, and I do want to allow some time for us to get into the briefing of the SEPA. And so I think this is a good stopping point for here, because we're not going to finish this tonight, obviously.
Any comments on DT 41? Okay, then we'll pause it here. I'll make a note. This is where we ended, and we'll pick up the next time around from here.
Okay.
Thank you.
I would also like to suggest that we take a 5-minute break before we dive into the next topic.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you, Betty.
So we'll pick back up at 8:45. 2050 supplemental draft EIS.
Also you.
So for those of you who like acronyms, we've just SDEIS. For those of you who don't like acronyms, we just refer to it as the supplemental draft. So for whatever shortcoming works better for you, so you don't have to read out the whole long name. All the places in here, just for the sake of just making slides that don't repeat, we will use SDEIS. So the reason why it is titled this way is because we did issue a draft environmental impact statement last year. This document is a supplemental document, an additional evaluation to be building upon that initial draft environmental impact statement, and then we'll issue a formal final EIS later this year. Okay. So for today, we'll just dive right in. This should be a familiar to you graphic. This is a multi-year process. We are getting really close to the end, which is great, exciting. We are in the middle of our public comment period. This will lead to that final or FEIS with adoption next year. So what is the purpose of this supplemental draft? So we have incorporated additional information. Obviously, we had some policy and regulatory conversations in the draft environmental impact statement, but it was general. We were able to get a lot more specific now that we're a lot further along in the review process for those updates. We've also integrated a lot more detail about the SEPA planned action updates that are planned for Overlake, and we added section 6.2, which talks about the SEPA infill exemptions that we're going to be integrated in. I'll talk a little bit more about that later because that's one of the more exciting pieces and parts that are moving forward. The other thing that the supplemental does is it takes that preferred alternative and it incorporates all the feedback from the draft EIS, how that went into the development of the preferred alternative. It responds to state law for housing. So there's a lot of different pieces and parts that were thrown into this supplemental. The other thing that's really important to note that this supplemental EIS shows that we can accommodate the growth that it's been assigned, but it also identifies the areas where we need infrastructure investments. So growth requires adjustments, and we might need different things to go in place. So the supplemental has some very specific recommendations or identifications of needs. So the things that are studied in the supplemental draft are very similar to what was studied in the initial draft environmental impact statement. But you'll, for those of you who've seen this graphic before, what is new is that lower right-hand corner. So the more specific information about the policy and code updates and the SEPA planned action in specific that infill exemptions. So all of these topics are evaluated in the supplemental draft EIS. So I very quickly just going to give some reminders about the growth allocations and they should be familiar to you. What went into the preferred alternative and the development of that preferred alternative. You see this slide as well too, but for those who haven't been following along, we had a lot of previous conversations. We've adopted the Environmental Sustainability Action Plan. We've had conversations about temporary construction dewatering. All of those pieces and policies have gone into the work that we're continuing to do. They all integrate together. We had a lot of community feedback on the draft environmental impact statement and the alternatives that were studied in that. We've got a lot of new legislative changes, new requirements, but also new allowances. All of that was folded into this work. And so I won't go too much into this, but it's there for reference. We did focus a lot of the growth into Overlake, Downtown, and Barrymore. The elsewhere listed here is our corridors and the work that we're doing in the regional retail, rezoning to mixed use, those types of things. So elsewhere doesn't necessarily mean just out in the middle of nowhere. Willow's corridor is included here too. So it just means that it's not in one of the centers, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's just scattered. So what we have done is we took the work that was in the draft environmental impact statement, which is alternative 1, no change to current policies. This is everything that we have capacity for today. The 2 alternatives that were studied included the continuation of the focus on the 2 centers primarily of downtown and Overlake, but also Marymore as well. We've integrated the work with the new Southeast Industrial Center. The centers and corridors was in alternative 3. The preferred alternative, it was a part of the elements of what went into the preferred alternative come from all 3 of the other alternatives. So there was more growth in downtown in the no action alternative. We're definitely still focusing a lot on our centers. The element about Overlake, building heights and whatnot came from the centers, and that continued forward. But you'll see that the growth pattern and distribution of pattern really matches very closely to the centers and corridors. So you see elements of all 3 of what was studied under the draft environmental impact statement went into the preferred alternative. It's very, very similar to what was studied. There's not a lot of major divergence there. We've updated some other graphics as well, just to help illustrate how similar the preferred alternative is to what was studied. Again, one of the things that this diagram is helpful for is understanding how each of the choices that we make distribute growth throughout our community. But again, that elsewhere column doesn't necessarily mean scattered. So jobs elsewhere includes Willows Corridor, which is a major employment center as well. So just keep that in mind. So as we start to look forward, we thought it would be helpful to look just at the what does this mean in 2050 from a distribution of growth pattern based on our current no action changes. And you see that they are very similar. So the preferred alternative distribution of growth around our community is very similar, and both for jobs and housing. You'll see the patterns are very similar. So then when we get into studying and the report card version of the supplemental, you'll start to see that the preferred alternative, which you'll see here, is P. Sometimes is in the middle, sometimes is it on the right, sometimes it's on the left. This is just something that is to help understanding of do we have to enhance the mitigation. So the further to the right it is, the more changes we might need to make to our infrastructure, maybe some code updates, et cetera. So I do want to point out that some of what you'll see on these slides, the reason why the preferred alternative might be to the right is just because there's more people. The Mayor and Council asked us to have a little bit of buffer so that we can have growth in different places or different patterns. So we do have slightly higher numbers. So slightly higher number of people means a little bit more accommodation might be needed. So we are definitely going to have some unavoidable impacts for the growth, but most of that will be mitigated by the code updates that we're working on or our existing codes. So we have a pretty robust environmental code framework currently, but a lot of the work that's happening with the Redmond 2050 is enhancing that even more. So if there's any questions on any of these slides, feel free to ask, but for tonight, it's a briefing. We want to make sure that you understand what's here. There's a couple of other pieces and parts that we wanted to highlight, but if you have any questions on these, just let me know. So.
If we could go back a few slides to the new graphic that you'd put together with that one. Mm-hmm. Can you just talk for a minute about the 90th and Willows change?
So the 90th and Willows area was studied under, excuse me, under one of the growth alternatives. So the feedback from that conversation, especially just in general from the community, was that's an idea that needs additional study. It's not something that we're ready to move forward with now. It was half and half. Some people were, that's a great idea. Some people were like, I'm not so sure. But it was something that we said we will not move forward with during Redmond 2050, but it might come back after Redmond 2050 as we start to do our neighborhood plan updates. It might come back as something that gets revisited and some additional study that goes into it. There's definitely some interest. There's definitely opportunity there, but there's also environmental considerations and studies that would be needed to figure out how to pull that off. So.
Go ahead.
So if you could go back to the slide with the impacts, please.
These?
Yes.
Okay.
So I read with great interest a good part of this report. I really like the preferred alternative. I think it's the most flexible option out there, which means that in the future, if somebody changes their mind about certain things, we have the options. So I think that's great. But I do believe that I think there are a couple of things that I don't see here, and maybe it's there in the background. So if you could provide either more information or like responses to this, that would be great. So I see the water quality issue come up in terms of it being the water study looked at pervious, impervious surfaces in each of the alternatives, the quality of water for the rivers, lakes, and I believe climate change was mentioned. Mitigation also mentions it but doesn't get into it. So my question then is twofold. Do we have in-depth studies which layers on growth and climate change impacts, given more frequent droughts? So it's not just about recharging the aquifers, and I'll come to that in the second point, but it is also about ensuring that Cascade Water Alliance and our partners are on the same page in terms of how we study water for our growth, because we are not the only ones growing. So there's a cumulative growth impact coupled with a cumulative, not necessarily cumulative, it could even be exponential climate change impact. So where do we stand on this? And should we be referencing something that is happening at the regional level because the water resource is shared, or not? And then the second part of that is for our own groundwater wells, the aquifers, have we studied what that impact is going to be? And we heard from David earlier today about the CARA. So looking at the aquifers becoming more important for water to ensure the quality of the aquifer water is important. So the mitigation should, I know it mentions that the CARA regulations be studied and strengthened, but part of that should also be whether we want to combine CARA 1 and CARA 2 so that we are, because the climate change thing, again, we're planning for the long run. So anything in CARA 2 is fair game when we're talking about Redmond 2050. So the idea that we need to study this more, so any data that you can share on climate change being layered on is, I think, critical to this piece. And so that's, and for me, that is important because there are adverse impacts indicated because of the growth, and that's okay. But if we don't know all the adverse impacts, we cannot plan for it.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And we've spoken separately too. I just want to provide a little bit of information here as well. This does a lot of that, and also other documents do a lot of that too, and so how they're integrated together. So for reference, we added to the work that we're doing the climate vulnerability assessment work early on. And that was completed before we did the draft environmental impact statement. That was included in the analysis. So as you go through each of the sections, it's not necessarily super clear if you're looking for it. This is the section on it, because it's integrated within each section. So if you're looking under water, there's a section that talks about the climate change. And if you're looking under sewer, there's a section about water climate change. So then there's also the climate vulnerability assessment in a separate section. So it was used by the consultants that were doing the work. They did evaluate it. There wasn't an overlay of the two together. They had to look at them separately because of how the information relates to each other. But they did look at them together at the same time. They're just different modeling and different software and that type of thing. But it was incorporated in there. There is some additional work that needs to happen over time of how we might need to rebuild our models to incorporate looking at those together so that we know that pipe needs to come up 4 feet, not just that pipe. It needs to go from 8 inches to 12 inches, right? So there is some future work that we need to do to incorporate that, but that will take time, especially since some of those models are regional. And so rebuilding how we model is not necessarily something that we could tackle within this time frame. So they needed to keep those things parallel, but they did review them together. There is also then the water systems plan that we're doing internally, and the work that you've recently looked at did not include the final because we're not done with our work. So they already know and are preparing to come back and do some edits to finalize that. We can add some additional work in there, and so the additional information on how they all go together could go in that. And then how Washington works from a service provider perspective is that we're all assigned growth, right? So they know how the growth is going to go, and we just have to figure out the details. And then the service providers then go in after the fact and figure out, do we need a new source of water? Or so they do their piece. They know the growth that they have to figure out in their realm, and then they just have to go figure out what it's going to take to make it work. So it's the same for electric providers or sewer, or whatever, whoever the provider is. If it's you as a city or an external provider, we do our work, and then they have to go do their work. But they all integrate. We talk to each other. We work really closely together. But there are pieces and parts of all of that work that happen in different places and different documents. But the work that goes into the supplemental, and I'll work closely with the partner because we've had some separate conversations, is there might be some additional information that we might be able to fold into the final EIS just to provide some additional information. But then we can also relay some of that conversation to the internal team that's working on the water plan, and then we can also relay some information to Cascade Water Alliance and other partners too as well to enhance the information providing opportunities. It is going into it. It's not necessarily as crystal clear as maybe we could make it, but yes, climate change and the impacts of all the growth, that is a part of the environmental work that's happening and underway.
A follow-up on that, I think we talked, like, the way I see it is wetlands are addressed, rivers, lakes, streams are addressed. If it would make sense to have preparation for drought as a separate section for each of the things, that's what, in the event we have a drought and the aquifer is not recharging right, then I know that escalates up. And I know our agreement with Cascade Water Alliance should take care of that, but we need to be able to say that 40% of our water may not come from the wells, then what's next? And that's part of this assessment, I think. So at least divvying up and see what that range looks like in a bad year or a bad set of years, I think is part of that environmental impact we should study.
Yeah, and I do think that that might be something that isn't necessarily, that level of specificity doesn't go into this document, it does go into the functional plan updates.
Right.
But we can relate to the folks who are doing that it would be helpful to have that specific conversation called out that way.
Right, even if you reference it broadly saying we need to study it, it's there, and then we can kind of have that conversation. I just don't want it to be left out. So,
It's valid.
thank you.
So thank you.
Commissioner Weston.
I had another systemic
I'm
question.
sorry?
I had another systemic question. So similar to climate change, I didn't see earthquakes in here, and that's interesting to me. Or actually, no, I saw it once, and there were 3 times in like the appendix that has all of the resources. But one of the like eye roll community comments that I hear come up a lot is the idea that downtown is in a liquefaction zone if we get a large enough quake. And yeah, City Hall, all the emergency services. So I don't know if it's actually an EIS question. It sort of seems like it would be, or if there's a different way it could
It's
be
in
pointed.
here, it's a part of what, you'll see it geotechnical and critical areas and whatnot. So I'll look up the section that is specific for that, but it was considered, especially.
I just did a Control F search on the PDF. And I only found one reference in 1.9.2 saying that, like alluding to earthquake standards.
Okay.
That it complies. So maybe we could just have a section that actually calls out the impact.
Make it a little bit more clear that that's, okay.
Right, and I don't know if we need a heat map or if there are heat maps.
Okay.
But it seems likely that in the next few decades, there's like a reasonable enough chance that we'd have to encounter a plan for that I'd like it called out.
I think there is actually even a map, but I'll find and I'll email you some additional resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky.
Commissioner Nueva Camino.
Becky, this is definitely a curiosity question. When we were on slide 12 and we called out plants and animals impacts, I know currently there's a pretty large conversation happening with our neighbors in Duval and Carnation about the current elk herd that is very large, and they're seeing some pretty record numbers, and they're seeing the impact that it's having on the land with the elk herds. We see this in downtown with coyotes in the middle of the night walking down our downtown streets, and they're growing. Our bunnies too, but they're more of a nuisance than anything. When it starts coming into, not only are we impacting the environment, but also the environment is impacting us, where can we find our plan or our response to that?
That's a really good question. Let me talk to a few folks and see if I can.
From a conservation point, you know, we're looking at if the numbers aren't controlled in a way, you know, having some of our neighborhood bears getting into garbage and, you know, dying from garbage bags.
And having their own Facebook page.
Oh, and apparently having their own Facebook page.
Education Hill Bear. There's a Facebook page for the Education Hill Bear.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right, well, no, I'll find out, and it's definitely not going to, this document's done, it's published, you know?
Yeah.
But there are ways that we can provide additional information to you separately, or there's things that we could potentially add into the final EIS or other functional plans. That particular question might be just an off-site, yeah, I'll just get some information on
Okay.
how that, I think it's a good question, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, to Commissioner Weston's point about earthquakes, the geologic hazards are addressed somewhat, and the whole conversation is about having earthquake, the mitigation is to have earthquake standards. Is that something that is, when we put in the mitigations and like mitigation strategies, is that a sign that we're going to put every one of those mitigation strategies into the policies and the code? Or is it something that, hey, we recognize that these are the potential solutions, we're going to pick some of these?
There's a couple of different ways that we do that. The environmental impact statement doesn't list every single strategy under the sun, right? But it does include the ones that we're considering or the ones we already have in place. Some of the other things to keep in mind too is when we identified these hazard areas, that was a part of what went into figuring out where we put growth and where we might not want to put growth too. So avoidance of impacts is part of what was this process as well. And so it's integrated in a number of different ways. So geological hazards and earthquake hazards could have impacts not just on the liquefaction zones, but like loose soil areas, right? Or so, I mean, like there's lots of different ways that they all integrate. And so the way that this is set up is that we've updated the best available science document as well. That was a separate document that was currently updated. And to make sure that we have all of the mitigation that we're moving forward with is the best practice of current. And then we will integrate that with code updates as well, but we're also integrating that into things like our planned action. So with the planned action, then we can get very specific. So we know the planned action says in this particular area that we know this level of growth and this kind of growth. And so that way, in that place, we can get very, very specific. This is exactly how we're going to mitigate for that. But otherwise, we're counting on citywide policies, citywide regulations, best practices, et cetera, moving forward. As new ideas and new technology come in play, we'll roll that out as well. It's just acknowledging the level of impacts and the fact that we are going to be doing mitigation to move forward and address those areas. Is that helpful?
Okay, I don't want to fall too deep into the weeds on this because we've still got more stuff to get through tonight, so.
But if you have in-depth questions, please feel free to email me or we can have a phone call. And yeah, I know there's a lot. I mean, it's 650 pages,
Right.
20 pages.
There's a lot,
so
and this is not
it's a lot.
the only time we're going to talk about it. I just want to be sure we get through the rest of this presentation tonight. So we're already at 9:15. So.
There's a couple of things I do want to make sure that we hit on. So there's definitely a lot of information in there, and in all the summary documents, the report card has some high-level feedback. But the main takeaways is accommodating growth, it requires changes. And those changes could be code changes, they could be infrastructure changes. It could be taking a pipe from 8 inches to 12 inches. It could be any number of things. So we know that we'll have to make some changes to accommodate the level of growth. The supplemental draft helps identify some of those changes. So some of those things are going to be transportation-related mitigations. We do want to point out that we're moving away from vehicle-based analysis and solutions. We're looking at more multimodal solutions. So that's different from the past. That's also in line with a lot of regional policy changes and recent legislative changes. So the state has actually recently made some updates specifically trying to get communities to move in the direction that Redmond's already moving in. So just want to point out there's work that's underway with the Transportation Master Plan on those particular mitigations, but we're not going to be seeing a lot of widening of roads, for instance. There are a couple of new roads and new connections that we still need to make, but we're going to be starting to look at multimodal connections. The other thing we do want to point out is there's some sewer mitigations that we needed. We knew, for instance, we were going to have some pipe updates in Overlake. It's not a surprise that we have some sewer mitigation. But there is some sewer mitigation needed specifically for downtown that popped out from the modeling. There's challenges because downtown's flat, right? So getting just piping and pumping our waste to the regional collection is a challenge in a flat environment. There's also how the county pipes and the city pipes connect, has some challenges. They're trying to redesign that connection to make it work better. But there's some issues there as well. So adding growth on top of that in a flat area with some other challenges, there's going to be some needs in there. So that will involve upsizing of some pipe. We're not exactly sure where we would go though. It will probably involve one or more pump stations in downtown. Again, it's flat, so we can't take advantage of any type of, so we got to get it from over there to over there somehow. That'll involve some type of pumping. In Marymore, we built the infrastructure, and then there was some kind of an after effect. The development came in and provide fees. It'll probably look something like that, but how we fund that in the future will be a future decision. So it's not a need today. We're looking at build-out conditions. There's a lot of study that will need to get there. The timing of when we need that is unknown at this point because the modeling was future build-out conditions. So keep that in mind. But I do wanted to point out, as you can see, the areas in yellow and red on the map are the areas where we need some type of infrastructure improvements. This is today with the no action alternatives. You see there is some yellow and red on this map. At the 2050 preferred alternative, you can see that spreads out quite a bit further across downtown. So the impacts of where changes will need to be made are going to be broader. And it just means that these are the areas where, in order to accommodate that future build-out conditions, we're going to have to invest in our community and the infrastructure. So we do wanted to point that out. That was one of the findings of the supplemental draft modeling. The other thing I do want to point out is that we are now moving into a place where most of the city is going to all of the city will have some type of SEPA related to housing under either the planned action or an infill exemption. So I wanted to walk you through, because this is new. We knew about this overlay planned action, so I won't go into that too deep, but for those of you who aren't as familiar with what that means, a planned action, it pre-does the environmental work for you, and it looks at it at an area-wide level. It includes non-residential and residential, includes the full mitigation and the exact specific amounts of growth under that planned action. So it's a very specific pre-done SEPA evaluation. Infill exemptions are under state law where they say, you do not need to do this evaluation if you fall within these specific categories. For downtown and Marymore, we're doing infill exemptions under the allowance of state law that covers housing and mixed use that includes housing. And they're going to have separate infill exemptions because the mitigation for downtown will look a little differently, because what you just saw from what mitigation is going to need in Marymore, because we just installed a lot of infrastructure in Marymore. Okay, so that we're going to have a downtown infill exemption and a Marymore infill exemption that will cover housing and mixed use with housing. We will also then have a citywide infill exemption that will cover everywhere else. So if you're not under the overlay SEPA exemption or the planned action or the infill exemptions for downtown and Marymore, you'll be covered under the citywide infill exemption. This is new. The state law just allowed this exemption. It is for housing and missing middle housing. So it doesn't have mixed use. It doesn't have the commercial component. It's a lesser infill. But what this means is that all of the city will cover housing through this pre-done SEPA work. So that means that the individual SEPA evaluation will no longer need to happen at the project level, if it is compliant with the comp plan update. If they want to do something that's outside of what we've studied, then additional research and evaluation will have to be done. But this should streamline housing development. It's one of the ways that we're moving forward. We definitely required a little bit of extra work in the supplemental draft. The section 6.2 is pretty extensive in there to make sure that we have that covered and we meet all the new legal requirements for that. I wanted to point that out because that is something that we were able to take advantage of, even though that new legislation happened in the middle of this process. So.
Cool. So just to make sure that I understand this, if I've got a lot on, say, Education Hill now, and I want to tear down a house and build a triplex on it, I would not have to do SEPA.
You'll have to, there'll be some paperwork that you'll have to do that you say you fall under the citywide infill exemption. It'll be confirmed that you're under what has been studied, and that's about it.
Okay.
So I had a question about the sewer, if it's okay to go back to that just very briefly. I had a question about the area on both maps that's red on Old Redmond Road. Is that because yeah, if you go, it's on this one, but also on this one, just in the bottom left corner. Mm-hmm. Is that because of the type of pipe or the size?
I'd have to go back into the actual study to say why this particular area is, but I know that some of the challenges in this particular area are specifically to how the pipes connect to the regional. So there's some redesign that's currently underway for the connections. Some of it is actual pipe sizes and some of it might be pumping needs. So I'd have to go back into the study for that. I think we'd asked someone from Public Works if they could be here today. Let me see if they are on the call. They stuck it in.
Or if there's a way for
Oh,
me
there we
to
go,
look
Steve.
at-
Steve Hitchar, Public Works. Do you know that particular section?
That's a great question. I'd have to get back to you to give you the proper answer. I can study it here in a few minutes, but I think it'd be better if I just give you an answer offline.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
And while Steve's here, is there any other questions related to that work? Okay. Thank you, Steve.
You bet.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay, so next steps, we have, our public comment period is open through Friday, October 20th. We have a committee of the whole presentation on 10.3 and a staff report on 10.17. We have scheduled a public hearing here in the council chambers on 10.18. That SEPA public hearing happens with the SEPA public officials, so that is not a planning commission public hearing, just to clarify. You're used to having your public hearings. This is held separately. You're welcome to participate in that if you'd like. It is open to the public, obviously. It's a public comment, public hearing. And then the public comments will be closed that Friday after that public hearing. So we are hoping to then wrap up this process. We will respond to all of the comments that we received and request for additional information where we can. And we'll publish our final EIS before the end of this year. We're hoping for sometime around Thanksgiving, which will then allow us to start going into the adoption phases. So comprehensive plan updates, code updates, all of those pieces and parts will follow. Most of you are familiar with the fact that those things cannot happen, decisions cannot happen until after we publish a final EIS. Those final decisions have to wait. So adoption of updates will happen in 2024. That includes the updates to all of the infill exemptions. So what we are planning on doing is if the code regulation goes through and there's an associated SEPA ordinance that needs to go through, obviously when we adopt Overlake, we'll make sure the Overlake planned action is going through. The infill exemptions, if it's related to a section of code, and wherever we end up seeing it, you'll see how those go parallel. So as we start to look forward in the timing of things, we'll make sure that the Marymore infill exemption gets adopted with the Marymore zoning changes. So go through the timing. Okay. That is it. Here's just another reminder of where we are in this process. We'd be happy to connect with you if you have any more in-depth questions on this, but encourage either an email to me directly or a phone call. We can look through.
Yeah, sorry to cut people off, but I didn't want to get too deep into the weeds because,
No.
yeah, yeah, there were some more things I wanted to get to in the presentation. So, anything else? Okay, great.
But yeah, we do encourage folks to participate in the public comment period. We do recommend that you submit comments in writing via email. At the very front of the document, it gives all the information for how to participate in the public comment period.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Becky.
Okay, thank you.
And now we'll move on to our Redmond 2050 monthly update briefing.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Jeff Churchill here with you. The monthly update memo in your packet focuses on community design. I'm not going to say a lot about it because you already went through the community design policies earlier this evening. I do want to highlight that the kind of the main event, or at least the kickoff event around community design engagement is planned for October 26th Location and time TBD. We're actually meeting with Eastside for All and some community-based organizations tomorrow to talk through some of the details and also talk about what we might do coming out of that for the rest of the year. So stay tuned. I wanted to spend the rest of this briefing actually updating you on some pretty important milestones in the project. Last night, the City Council more or less finished its review of the Phase 1 policies. That's the park element, economic vitality, centers for Overlake, and housing. They didn't do all of that last night, but they kind of wrapped that up. There are a couple things that will be revisited at the time that the ordinances come back next fall. But that work is basically done. So that's very exciting. And that's policies only. I know you're still looking at Overlake and housing regulations, and those are coming back to you in November. Also, I think it was last week, although it may have been the week before, the King County Affordable Housing Committee reviewed and approved Redmond's housing element with a small number of recommendations to have it more closely aligned with the countywide planning policies. Redmond is the first city in the county to go through that process. It's a new process. So they learned with us what that process looks like. At the same time, King County itself also sent their housing element through. So now 1 out of 39 cities are done and the county is done. So they got a little more work to do. You are going to start seeing second drafts of elements in next month, starting with human services and annexation and regional planning. And you will see the first draft of the climate resilience and sustainability element next month. And that's all the new content there is. There is no more new content after that. That's, you'll have seen a draft of everything by that point. I should say, except the introduction and the glossary, table of contents, things like that. And a whole lot of zoning regulations. But as far as policies are concerned, you've seen almost everything. And that kind of wraps it up for the monthly update. Oh, and I know exciting for the next monthly update, to preview, the chair and the vice chair of the Community Advisory Committee are going to come and they're going to share kind of a summation of their work because they have been through all of the first drafts at least. So we'll have some time to have a conversation.
Cool. Thank you. Staff and commissioner updates.
Hello, staff has 2 updates for you. First, I want to remind Commission that in November and December, our schedules are kind of switched. It'll be a bunch of special meetings, so that's the 1st and 3rd Wednesday is when we'll meet, not the 2nd and 4th as usual. So please let the liaison know if you have any vacation plans coming up, just to ensure that we can make a quorum. And related to that, the quarterly PC liaison duties are switching. So the next meeting will actually have Glenn back in the saddle, and he will be fulfilling the Planning Commission liaison duties for the rest of the year. But as always, if you send any message to that planningcommission@redmond.gov email address, bunch of LRP staff have access to it, and we're always checking it, and we'll have redundancies for you. But those are the 2 main updates for you.
Great. Any commissioner updates? Tara.
Can I ask about this RHS student thing?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, please.
That was on your monthly update? What is that?
So there was attached to the memo, I could probably share my screen. Got it. We went up to Redmond High School on the 19th, and we asked them to illustrate with sidewalk chalk. I can't find the share button and talk to you at the same time. That's okay. Ian's going to share it. Thank you. With some prompts around what in the built environment would make Redmond a welcoming place, an inclusive place. As you've been talking about community design this evening, there was kind of some similar prompts. And that was 7 classes worth of AP Environmental Science students. And so we covered a lot of sidewalk. And what I've shared in the packet is the results in terms of the sidewalk art and some of the themes that came up, which were cultural inclusion, better street lighting for safety, wider sidewalks for safety, bicycle infrastructure, a lot of transportation items. fewer billboards and advertising signage, trees and natural habitat for animals and clean water, a community where many goods and services are available, especially walkable amenities, especially food, lively, especially food. We poll high school students when we're up there, and we ask them some version of the question, if there could be anything across the Redmond High School, what would it be? And the answer is always some restaurant. They love that Hartman Park and the pool are there. It's not about having less of that. It's having some kind of food that apparently is the number 1 and 2 and 3 answer is food.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Okay. Glad to hear from the high schoolers. Any other commissioner updates? If not, I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
And we are adjourned.